This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. Because when a government stops governing neutrally, it doesn't announce it. It experiments, it tests boundaries, it watches who flinches. What you are seeing right now is not chaos. It's a method, a slow substitution of rules with loyalty, of law with leverage. Money becomes pressure. Silence becomes safety. And disagreement starts to carry a price. Most people miss this moment because nothing appears to collapse. The lights stay on. The systems still run, but something essential has shifted underneath them. And once that shift locks in, it's almost impossible to reverse. If you want to understand how power actually works now, not how we were told it works, stay with me. Because the next piece reveals who is really holding the line and why that line is already under strain. I want to be very clear about what actually controls this system now. It is not ideology. It is not elections. It is not even policy. It is leverage. The modern federal government runs on money that has already been approved, already promised, already assigned. That money is supposed to move automatically through formulas, grants, and law. No favors, no punishments. But when that money is treated as optional, it becomes power. Not governing power, coercive power. What matters then is not what the law says, but who is obedient, who is quiet, who can be pressured. In that system, neutrality becomes a threat because neutral systems can't be aimed. They can't be used to reward loyalty or extract submission. So the pressure moves upstream toward administrators, toward states, toward institutions that depend on federal flows to function. And here's the critical shift. Once money becomes a signal instead of a service, every decision becomes political, even silence. That's the frame. And once you see it, the next move stops looking random. Because what comes next isn't about efficiency. It's about targeting. There was a time when this system moved slowly on purpose. Delays were safeguards. Rules were boring. Process mattered more than outcomes. That slowness wasn't failure. It was friction by design. Before, money moved because the law said it had to. Now, money pauses. It waits. It hovers. Before, disagreement triggered debate. Now, disagreement triggers review, reconsideration, administrative discretion. That phrase is doing a lot of work. The change didn't arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, through holds, through freezes, through reinterpretations that sounded technical enough not to alarm anyone. Nothing was announced. Nothing was overturned. The system still looked intact. But underneath, the default flipped from automatic to conditional, from neutral to evaluative. And that's the most dangerous kind of change. The kind that feels procedural. The kind you don't protest because it doesn't look like an attack until you realize the rules still exist. They're just no longer applied equally. And once that becomes normal, the next step isn't dramatic. It's selective. Then the pause became visible, not as a theory, as a shock. Billions of dollars already approved, already allocated, suddenly marked for removal. Not because projects failed, not because the math changed, but because maps did. Funding meant for clean energy didn't disappear everywhere. It narrowed. It targeted states that voted the wrong way, were told quietly that the money might not come. This wasn't a budget debate. It was conditional obedience. The justification sounded technical. Reviews, delays, reprioritization. But the logic was simple. Loyalty kept the lights on. And then it crossed from spreadsheets into concrete. Steel in the water. Work crews halted. A major offshore energy project ordered to stop midstream. That's when the system flinched. Not voters. Not Congress. The courts. Judges didn't argue about politics. They didn't weigh intentions. They looked at the admissions, at the criteria, and they said one word: illegal. The money had to move. The work resumed. If you're wondering why this matters beyond energy, stay with me. Because this wasn't the story. It was the test case. Here's the part most people never see. Because the real system doesn't break at the top. It breaks in how damage is distributed. When funding becomes conditional, the harm is asymmetric. The people who decide don't absorb it. The people who depend on it do. Administrators delay. Agencies review. Money stops moving. And while lawyers argue costs pile up downstream, contracts stall. Staff are laid off. Services thin out. The system relies on that lag. Because by the time a court steps in, the damage has already landed somewhere else. This is how it works. The executive tests a boundary. If no one stops it, the rule changes. If someone does, the loss is socialized. States carry it. Cities carry it. Families carry it. And the benefit flows upward. Control without responsibility. Pressure without fingerprints. That's why this strategy repeats. Not because it always wins, but because even when it loses, it still extracts something. Time, uncertainty, compliance. And once institutions start budgeting for retaliation, once they start anticipating punishment, the leverage has already done its job, which is why the next move didn't stay in infrastructure. It went somewhere far more fragile. This time, there was no waiting period. No long pause, no slow bleed. The target was immediate and human. Billions of dollars for childcare, for social services, for families already operating on margins. The logic didn't change. Only the consequences did. Funds were frozen, not because programs failed, but because states didn't comply. Daycare centers faced closure. Parents faced impossible choices. Workers couldn't show up if children had nowhere to go. This wasn't abstract. This was structural stress applied to daily life. And again, the explanation sounded procedural, temporary, under review. But the criteria were clear enough to be admitted out loud. Certain states, certain governments, certain outcomes at the ballot box, that admission mattered. Because when the case reached a judge, there was no ambiguity left to debate, no discretion to hide behind. The order was blocked. The funds released, but here's the acceleration point. Each attempt came faster than the last. Each one pushed closer to survival systems. Each one tested how much damage could be done before intervention. And the question stopped being, can this be stopped? It became, how much can break before it is? At this point, it stops being theoretical. Because this is where you enter the system. You don't see the memo. You don't hear the threat. You feel the delay. The daycare says funding is uncertain. The clinic says services are reduced. The grant that paid for staff, research, outreach, suddenly isn't reliable. So you adjust, you cut back, you stay quiet. That's the unseen consequence. When power becomes retaliatory, people don't wait to be punished. They pre-comply. States hesitate. Institutions soften language. Professionals think twice before speaking. Not because the law changed, but because the risk did. And this is the genius of the system. It doesn't require constant enforcement. It trains behavior. If you've ever wondered why experts sound cautious, why agencies hedge, why criticism feels muted, this is why. If this feels familiar, if you've felt that pressure yourself, pause for a second. Stay with this. Share it if you need to. Because what's coming next explains why this no longer stays contained. It spills. Once this kind of pressure becomes routine at home, it doesn't stay domestic. Because federal money doesn't just support states. It anchors systems that reach outward. Research funding connects labs across borders. Energy policy links markets. Elections signal stability. Military authority shapes global risk. So when internal rules become conditional, external confidence erodes. Allies watch budgets swing on loyalty. Markets watch projects halted midstream. Institutions abroad recalibrate quietly away from dependence. And adversaries notice something else. They see a government spending its energy enforcing obedience instead of coherence. They see courts stepping in daily to block executive action. They see legislators rebelling in fragments, not unity. That doesn't look like strength. It looks like strain. This is how internal governance failures turn into geopolitical signals. Not through announcements, through hesitation. Investment slows. Coordination weakens. Credibility thins. And here's the dangerous part. None of this requires collapse. All it takes is enough uncertainty that everyone starts hedging, pulling back, waiting. The system still functions, but less confidently, less predictably. And once the world starts pricing in instability, the feedback loop accelerates, which brings us to what happens next. When pressure, resistance, and time collide, here's where the timeline splits. Not into outcomes, into trajectories. There are 3 paths from here, all of them plausible, none of them clean. The first is adjustment. Institutions absorb the pressure. Courts keep blocking. Congress keeps intervening. The system stiffens. Governance becomes slower, more legalistic, more defensive. Nothing breaks, but nothing moves easily again. The second is erosion, not dramatic. Incremental, each failed attempt still costs time, still creates hesitation, still trains caution. The law technically holds, but behavior changes underneath it. Compliance replaces trust. Silence replaces dissent, and then there's rupture. This happens if enforcement outruns resistance. If retaliation accelerates faster than courts can respond, if legislatures fracture instead of coordinating, if enough actors decide protection is no longer guaranteed, rupture doesn't look like a coup. It looks like selective enforcement becoming normal, like neutrality quietly disappearing. And the system doesn't tell you which path you're on. You only know in retrospect. That's the tension we're sitting in now. Because the future isn't decided by intent. It's decided by which behavior gets rewarded next. And that brings us to the part no one can outsource. Nothing in this story ends cleanly. There is no moment where someone steps to a podium and announces the system has changed. There is no single vote, no single ruling, no single election night that resolves this. What happens instead is normalization. Courts issue orders every day. Congress blocks, restores, rebukes. Institutions adapt. People learn where the risks are. And slowly, the extraordinary becomes routine. A government that tries to punish dissent. A judiciary forced to act as constant brake. A legislature governing in fragments. A public learning to live with instability as background noise. That is not collapse. It's something more ambiguous and more dangerous. Because systems don't fail when they're attacked. They fail when everyone adjusts just enough to survive inside the damage. So the question isn't whether the law still exists. It does. The question is whether neutrality survives repeated attempts to erase it. If you want to understand what comes next, not the headlines, but the pressure points, stay here. Follow this thread. Because the next phase won't announce itself either. And once you recognize it, you won't be able to unsee it.